णsive. The storm gathers. Smoke hangs low over a shattered skyline as dawn filters through drifting ash. Streets once lined with shops and apartments are now corridors of rubble, brick dust clinging to the air and coating everything in a dull gray film. The distant thud of artillery rolls through the city at irregular intervals, followed by the rattle of small arms echoing between hollowed buildings. Civilians move quietly through basements and cellars, carrying what they can, listening for footsteps overhead. Columns of soldiers advance block by block, their progress measured not in kilometers but in stairwells, courtyards, and shattered rooms. Tanks grind forward over broken pavement, engines straining, tracks slipping on debris. Above them, aircraft pass in brief, blurred arcs through gaps in cloud. The battle unfolding here is not only for a capital city, it is for the end of a regime, the shape of post-war Europe, and the final chapter of a war that has consumed a continent. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was fighting on collapsing fronts. In the West, Allied armies had crossed the Rhine River and were advancing deep into German territory. Strategic bombing had devastated industrial centers and transportation networks. Fuel shortages, disrupted supply lines, and heavy losses had weakened the German military's ability to conduct coordinated operations. In the East, the Red Army had pushed steadily westward after major victories in 1944, liberating vast areas of Eastern Europe. Soviet forces stood on the Oder River, less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. The city, once the political and administrative heart of the Third Reich, had become a symbol as much as a strategic objective. Its fall would represent the military defeat of Nazi Germany and the collapse of its central authority. Inside Germany, the leadership remained publicly defiant, but the reality was clear. Resources were exhausted, reserves were limited, and many units consisted of hastily trained recruits, older men and youths. Yet orders were issued to defend the capital at all costs. For the Soviet Union, capturing Berlin would not only end the war in Europe, but also shape influence over the post-war settlement. The convergence of military necessity and political consequence made the coming battle both inevitable and historically decisive. Act 2. The plans. The Soviet assault on Berlin was commanded by Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev, whose fronts had advanced through Poland and Eastern Germany with enormous manpower and artillery support. Their forces included experienced rifle divisions, tank armies, and massive concentrations of guns and rocket launchers. The primary objective was to encircle and capture Berlin quickly, preventing German forces from regrouping and ending organized resistance. German defense of the city fell under General Helmuth Weidling, appointed to command the Berlin defense area in the final days. His available forces were a mix of depleted army units, Waffen-SS formations, police, and the Volkssturm, a militia of older men and teenagers. Supplies were limited, communications unreliable, and air support nearly non-existent. Yet the city's dense urban terrain offered defensive advantages, and orders from the highest levels insisted that Berlin be held. For the Soviets, speed was essential to preempt any separate surrender to Western allies and to secure political leverage. For the Germans, the goal had narrowed to delay, holding out long enough to allow civilians and soldiers to flee westward, or simply to fulfill orders in the face of inevitable defeat. The terrain approaching Berlin consisted of rivers, canals, forests, and small towns, all of which could be turned into defensive positions. The Silo Heights, a line of elevated ground east of the city, formed a natural barrier. German forces fortified these positions with trenches, anti-tank ditches, and artillery emplacements, hoping to slow the Soviet advance before it reached the urban core. Logistics on both sides reflected the late stage of the war. Soviet supply lines stretched back hundreds of kilometers, but were supported by rail networks rapidly repaired behind the front. Fuel and ammunition were prioritized for the final push. German logistics, by contrast, were severely strained. Rail lines were disrupted by bombing, and shortages of fuel and transport vehicles hampered movement. Weather and terrain added complications. Spring rains turned open ground to mud, slowing vehicles and making off-road movement difficult. Smoke from burning towns and industrial areas mixed with low cloud, reducing visibility. Despite these obstacles, Soviet forces massed overwhelming firepower for a final offensive. When the attack began in mid-April 1945, it would be one of the most intense artillery bombardments of the war. Passed through the collision, the assault opened with a massive artillery barrage along the Oder River and the Silo Heights. Thousands of guns fired in coordinated waves, the flashes briefly illuminating smoke and low cloud. As infantry and armor advanced, they encountered determined resistance from German units using prepared positions and the natural cover of forests and villages. Progress was slower than expected. Flooded areas and difficult terrain channeled Soviet forces into narrow corridors where anti-tank weapons and artillery could inflict losses. Commanders adjusted plans, committing reserves and shifting axes of advance. After several days of heavy fighting, Soviet forces broke through the Silo Heights defenses, opening the road to Berlin. Once inside the outer districts, the character of the battle changed. Wide avenues gave way to narrower streets, courtyards, and multi-story buildings. German defenders used cellars, upper floors, and rubble for cover, forcing Soviet units into close-quarters combat. Tanks moved cautiously, vulnerable to handheld anti-tank weapons fired from short range. Artillery was brought forward to fire directly into strongpoints, reducing buildings to debris-strewn shells. At this moment in the battle, do you think this decision was a mistake or was it unavoidable? Let me know your view in the comments. Even as resistance stiffened in the city center, Soviet forces continued to encircle Berlin, cutting remaining roads and isolating the defenders from any realistic hope of relief. णsive 4. The break. The decisive phase came as Soviet armies completed the encirclement of Berlin and advanced toward key political and symbolic targets in the city center. Government districts, railway hubs, and major bridges became focal points of fighting. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery improved as units adapted to urban warfare, using small assault groups supported by heavy firepower to clear buildings systematically. German command and control deteriorated rapidly. Communications were disrupted, units became isolated, and orders often failed to reach frontline defenders. Leadership within the city issued increasingly unrealistic directives, but practical authority shifted to local commanders, trying to manage shrinking pockets of resistance. A symbolic and practical turning point was the assault on central government buildings, including the Reichstag. Though heavily damaged and of limited military value by this stage, its capture signaled the collapse of organized defense in the heart of the capital. As Soviet forces linked up across the city and tightened their grip, it became clear that Berlin could no longer be held in any meaningful sense. The fall of the city would not just be a tactical victory, but the end of Nazi Germany's ability to direct the war. णsive, the aftershocks. The Battle of Berlin was among the most destructive urban battles in European history. Casualties were severe. Soviet forces suffered tens of thousands killed and many more wounded in the final offensive. German military losses were also heavy, with large numbers killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Civilian casualties were significant as well, the result of bombardment, street fighting, and the collapse of essential services. On 30th of April 1945, Adolf Hitler died in Berlin as Soviet troops closed in on the government district. In the days that followed, remaining German authorities sought surrender. On 2nd May, organized resistance in Berlin ceased. Within a week, Germany signed an unconditional surrender, ending the war in Europe. Militarily, the fall of Berlin eliminated the last center of coordinated German command. Remaining forces elsewhere in Germany either surrendered or were overrun. Politically, the city's capture solidified Soviet control over eastern Germany and influenced the division of Europe that would follow. The Battle of Berlin marked the definitive end of Nazi rule and the collapse of the Third Reich's central authority. With the capital captured and leadership gone, there was no longer any mechanism to sustain organized resistance. The European War, which had begun with German offensives, concluded with German territory occupied and its government dismantled. The battle also shaped the geopolitical landscape of the post-war world. Soviet control of Berlin and much of Eastern Europe contributed directly to the division of Germany and the emergence of opposing spheres of influence that defined the early Cold War. Decisions made in the aftermath regarding occupation zones, governance, and security arrangements would influence international relations for decades. For military historians, Berlin represents the culmination of total war in Europe, the convergence of massive armies, industrialized firepower, and urban combat on a scale rarely seen before or since. It illustrates how strategic objectives, political aims, and human cost become inseparable in the final stages of a prolonged conflict. Today, Berlin is a rebuilt city, its streets busy and its skyline restored. Yet traces of 1945 remain in memorials and preserved ruins. The battle that ended here did more than close a campaign. It reshaped borders, alliances, and the balance of power across a continent. History is shaped by moments like this. Share this story if it mattered to you, and follow the channel for more battles that change the world.